So good evening, everyone, and welcome back to our monthly pre-hospital webinar. And as we trawl through the various themes of pre-hospital care that interest me, tonight this brings us round to major trauma. Some of the interest about why it's difficult to do anything you don't see very often. Tonight's title is Major Trauma, a minor subset. That's a very, very small part of what ambulance crews do. Let's make our way into this and then we'll see where it takes us. So, what's the issue? I think over the last probably 10 to 15 years, ambulance services have changed in structure a lot. Certainly I remember being in the ambulance service many years ago, where if we got to 600 calls in a day total, then we'd had a really busy day, and the services were a bit smaller then, but I think it reflected on the nature of the calls we were dealing with then, using a pretty tough triage system, and dealing mostly with emergency care only, and that was a very, very sort of different model, and the ambulance service was a much, much smaller thing. Call volumes, as we now know, are huge, and over this winter particularly have been absolutely enormous, where we've got ambulance services that are managing millions of calls a year, and per service. And apart from some specialist practice, which we'll talk about in a little bit, then that call volume has just led to more ambulances. And has the amount of major trauma increased, exponentially as well? Then probably not. So we're going to discuss that as well and see why, things have changed over the last sort of 10 to 15 years. And that's more what this talk is about, rather than how we manage major trauma, which will be a whole separate thing. I know Caroline Leach on here is doing a really good series now about assessments of the different parts of the primary survey and major trauma. What we're trying to do here is find some themes that are going to help us. Andy, can you release the poll? So what we have set up here is a short questionnaire, because what we want to try and find out is, how much major trauma people see. So just tick one option. And what we want to know is, have you been to a major trauma patient? Now we're talking about a patient with genuine major trauma, not one coded as major trauma, because that's anyone with a sprained finger or whatever. But a major trauma patient, multi-system trauma patient, or serious injury that was taken to a major trauma center. So have you seen one in the last week, in the last month, in the last 6 months, the last 12 months, or longer than that? Or never been to a major trauma patient? Just trying to get a sort of a flash poll. Obviously, relying on people being honest in their answer. There's always someone you speak to who then goes, "Yeah, I went to 7 yesterday." We know that's probably not true. I think that's further reflected in our approach to the patient. Our general approach to the majority of pre-hospital patients is through a medical model, and in our medical model, which is quite right for the vast majority of patients that we see, the model is based around history, really, more than anything. The diagnosis in medical patients is nearly all in their medical history, in the recent history. What are the events leading up to it? What signs and symptoms do they have? What makes it better? What makes it worse? All that sample stuff, that, pain, PQR, STA stuff, or whatever sort of acronym you want to use. In our medical patient, the majority of it's in there, because as a whole, for many of them, their observations may be relatively normal or within normal range. And, the history is everything. That's a very different approach than our trauma patient. The trauma assessment tool to the left there, suggesting a very didactic, fixed approach to these patients to rapidly identify and treat life-threatening injuries and trauma that also in young people may not be given away by observations, and actually there's no sort of place in that primary survey for observations. And so the thought that 99% of the time that you can go to medical patients and use a medical model and then to be dispatched to a major trauma and change the way you work entirely to assess the patient in a different way, using a very hands-on didactic approach, not just, popping the NIBP cuff and SATS probe on and calling them good, is a very considerable problem. When, and I think we see the same reflected in major incidents. Some other countries in the world have changed their major incident model, because if you work one way all the time, and then because someone shouts the word major incident, you're supposed to change the way you work as an ambulance service, then funnily enough, we're not surprised when it all goes wrong, because you can't have that system where just because something's labeled one way or something's different, you can't change what you do 99% of the time. That's not how human beings work. So our approach also needs to be very different in identifying these patients, and using a completely different approach than we would in the vast majority of our medical patients. Exposure is a big part of it. Yeah, I think our poll at the start probably backed up my sort of suspicion that, an ambulance crew will probably see around 1 to 2 major traumas per year across the UK, in the role of a normal double crewed ambulance, unless you're in some sort of specialist role. And of course, we know specialist roles are important, because they have the exposure in the same way the major trauma model center hospital works, and the fact they have exposure to lots of patients. Funded sort of critical care scheme and all the massive expense that comes with that. Yeah, just taking the paramedics you have, and in a smaller pool, that means you can supply them with more training, more focused training, but also they get the experience. And that's something that we've diluted by adding more and more ambulances. And this may be a way to sort of take that back, that people actually have a role in dealing with these patients without actually a higher level of interventions, etc. What they gain is the experience in just being a really good paramedic at dealing with these things, and that may be a part of the future. I don't know. It's certainly an interesting thing. It's not something I've seen being done particularly anywhere else in the UK. So it's going to be very interesting to watch. Find my mouse cursor. It's vanished a second. A meaningful education, and this is obviously where my background is in education, and we do a lot of trauma education amongst other things. And I think there's always a word of caution about, all education. It really needs to be meaningful. It needs to be quality, evidence-based courses of whatever type or brand. I mean, this is the one I'm involved in, but I've no problem with other ITLS, ATAC, everything else. Yeah, quality education is quality education, whatever badge you put on it. Yeah, and I think that's the part of it. It needs to be meaningful education. It needs to have meaningful accreditation. It can't be what paramedic Bob thinks is a good idea to teach. It needs to have enough simulation, but the simulation shouldn't overrule the education. I think there is a slight trend towards that in some places in our pre-hospital education currently, with super simulation centres and multi-thousand-pound mannequins that look amazing but don't really add anything more than looking amazing. I think that money probably could be better spent in some cases. It should use a variety of environments, not carpeted classrooms, where it can be avoided, and use the same equipment as used in the workplace. And I think one of the rules, certainly where I work, at the start, we send people to these complex, sometimes multi-patient incidents, managing, dealing with the fire service and that sort of type stuff. Our fire and rescue colleagues are excellent and commonly now involved in patient care as well. And they practice a lot and we practice very little. Yeah, but we very, very rarely ever practice together. And if we do, it's often quite contrived, and it's there as more of a demonstration. So I think, if we're going to be good at these things, we need to practice more, and that isn't just fire and rescue colleagues, critical care colleagues, HEMS colleagues, whatever it might be. Yeah, if we're going to make this meaningful, we need to have that practice time. And I recognise that's in a huge burden of healthcare training that's needed, and time and cost and all that sort of thing. But really, if we don't, if we don't do that, we'll never crack that major sort of learning point. So that brings us to the end of sort of review about why there's a problem, I think, with, in my opinion, with major trauma, the issues we face in sort of how we address this, and how we can look at, how we can make ourselves better to manage these things, and how we need to change some of the things and systems